We've talked on past episodes about running audience surveys to learn more about the habits, needs and wants of your listeners. But gathering and reporting on data doesn't need to be limited to your show. It could extend to running topic or industry-wide reports that bring new insights to your niche, as well as fresh eyes and ears to your content. Joining me on Podcraft today is one of the most trusted voices when it comes to podcast research, Tom Webster of Sounds Profitable. It was a real privilege to be able to learn lessons from Tom's decades of experience, working on everything from Edison research to projects with the Howard Stern Show. Our kicking off point was around how when we think of terms like research, insights, data or reporting, they seem very much at odds with words like creativity or storytelling. But here's the thing, are they really?
You know, I've been doing research, audience research for about 30 years. And I don't think I've ever had this exact conversation with anybody on a podcast I've been on, but you are the person that I want to have it with. I remember doing so much different research, and it's not all been audio. I mean, earlier in my career, I was doing research on all kinds of, new products and services and, toilet paper, detergent, whatever. I mean, that was kind of my job, but also a lot of audio. And many times I would be placed in a box, and that box would be diametrically opposed to the box marked the creatives, right? And there would be the people from the agency or the brand team or the people that came up with the approach. And they would want to challenge the research, right? And they would want to challenge it on the grounds that I think, as Steve Jobs famously said, people don't like what they don't know, right? And all of that is true. All of that is true. But here's the thing that research will tell you. It will tell you, well, this is how they're going to react to it. So might you change how you message it? Might you change how you approach it? I'm not telling you not to do it. But you should know how people are going to initially accept it, or you should know what people's gut reaction to this is going to be so you can mitigate that beforehand. I'm not telling you to change your product. I'm not telling you to not be as creative, but it's always bothered me that people view the research and data side of things as not creative, when actually what it gives you is constraints, and constraints are really the key ultimately to creativity.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, yeah, and there's kind of a lot I want to pick up on there. First and foremost, like before we dive into that, I mean, your background, Tom, like you were at Edison and you came up with, was it there, the Edison podcast metrics, and you co-authored the Infinite Dial report as well, and you're talking about like a 30-year background. So, I mean, what sort of things, including those, have you kind of done over that period of time?
Yeah, I mean, I started my career even before Edison, back in the early 90s, with a radio research company. And that radio research company kept getting acquired by larger and larger broadcasters. And I ended up being in charge of music and audience research for a significant portion of major companies' radio stations. So, in a lot of big stations in New York, like Z100 and WKTU, and and also stations all around the world. And my job was to help keep them fresh, and to help keep them on track, both strategically with the tastes of the market in general, but also kind of tactically, like, are you tired of this song, and do you want to hear this song more or less, and all that kind of stuff. And all of that was based on something that the radio industry discovered really back in the 70s. And there was a company that started doing radio research, and at the time, FM radio was just wild and free form, and there was all kinds of wacky things going on in radio. And one company started doing research on the audience, just to maybe, is this music still viable? Is this music getting tired or whatever? And the stations that hired that company blew everybody off the map. Just absolutely destroyed the competition. And so very, very quickly, more and more radio research companies started to spring up, and then everybody had to start doing it, or they would just die in the ratings, right? So I came into the business in the 90s, and was doing a very kind of technologically advanced kind of audience research that really tapped into feelings and emotions and things like that. And the stations that my company worked with, it was a company called Broadcast Architecture, did really, really well. And so I learned a lot about the art side of research from that, because we were sort of doing research on emotions and not, collecting Excel spreadsheets and things like that. And in the course of doing that, I got to work with some of the most creative people that I've ever met. I've done research on the Howard Stern show. I've done research on the Elvis Duran morning show over here. I've done research in the UK. I used to do a lot of research for the Heart and Galaxy brands, which I think are now no more, but they were big stations at the time. So that really attuned me, I think, to the art side of things and to working with talent and working with really creative people. So that's always been kind of at the background. I mean, I do have an education in research, and when I came to Edison, I really did just focus on audio. But as far back as 2005, I really started to turn my attention to podcasting, and and I've worked on podcasting every year since then.
The thing about gathering data and reporting it is, most of us aren't trained in this. And on the surface level, it seems like a very easy thing to do. You just come up with some questions, you ask them, and then you get the answers, you look at them and you report on them, or maybe you notice the odd wee kind of correlation here and there. So I'd be interested to know about that. Like, what are some of the most frequent mistakes you see when people are kind of presenting the data that they've gathered and they've put together in report form?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake that I'm going to use the word amateur here. Let's just say person not trained in the craft, because this show is about craft. Is to confuse what can be asked in qualitative research with what can be asked in quantitative research, and those are big terms. But essentially, you use qualitative research to find out why people do things, and you use quantitative research to count how many people do those things and what those things are. That quantitative is the counting type of research, and qualitative is the reason why type of research. And a really big mistake that people might make is, let's say that you're making let's say you're manufacturing a toy, an action figure or something like that, and you ask in a quantitative survey, why did you purchase this toy? And you give them some choices, right? And choice number one is, I'm a fan of the TV show it's based on. Choice number two is, my friends all have this toy. And choice number three is, I'm a collector or whatever, right? Well, there are probably choices 4 through 20 here that you haven't considered, including I'm buying it as a gift. And because you have not fleshed out the multiple reasons why somebody might do something, you've kind of messed up your question. And people are either going to select other. And anytime I see a question where the biggest answer is other, I know I screwed that question up. Or you're going to force people to choose something that they don't really believe in. So I try never to use the word why in a quantitative survey. I think that's probably the biggest mistake people use. Unless you can really hone it down into a mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive list. And the language in that list has to come from your audience. It has to come from your respondents. It has to be the way that they talk. And the only way to do that is by having conversations with them, and that's qualitative.
I mean, it goes without saying, I guess, but when you put together your questions, really good idea, I suppose, to maybe get 5 or 10 folks you could kind of trust to go through it. It's amazing. Every time I've done that, it's amazing how many things pop up that I've just obviously missed, but I wouldn't have seen it and then put it out to the masses.
Yeah, it's writing a question is it's one of those things that everybody thinks they can do, and almost nobody does it well because it requires a really bizarre way of thinking. And I wasn't born with that way of thinking. I have a lot of training in that way of thinking, but it's an easy thing to do. It's really, really easy to mess up a question. But just to back up, I think the first thing to do is to find a way to talk to 4 or 5 listeners and just have a chat with them, just have a conversation with them, to have them have a virtual coffee with them. Maybe send them some merch or or something special from the show, and just have a conversation with them. And don't start writing any questions until you have that conversation. And those conversations are not going to be the final answers, right? They're not. You can't. If 3 of those 5 people tell you, "I hate it when you do this," that doesn't tell you shouldn't do that, but that does tell you it's something you should ask about. And so that's when you start writing the survey. And then, as you correctly point out, that's when you run it by 4 or 5 smart friends and ask them to pick it apart a little bit. And that's really I'm very fortunate with Sounds Profitable. We have some great partners, you included, that I love to work with, that will send me their survey questions. And the podcast host has done that, and I've done a lot of that stuff with our friends from SiriusXM and some other producers, where even if they're just sending out like a 5 or 6 question survey, they'll send it to me, and sometimes they'll be horrified at how marked up it is when I send it back, but uh, it absolutely makes the process better, because the thing you want to avoid is getting it back and not understanding what to do with the results. And so that's the filter that you should put any question through is, if I got this question back and it said A, B, or C, what do I do with that? And the bottom line is, if you ask that question and you don't know what you would do with the result of any of them, don't ask the question. Don't waste people's time.
What's your thoughts on approaching a report? I mean, let's say we're doing an industry wide report in whatever niche or topic we are within, and I might go into this thinking, here are 3 stories I might tell with the data. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because I mean, there might be an argument that you're trying to force an agenda. What's your kind of thoughts on that?
That's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. There's 2 kinds of research in anything, audio, podcasts, laundry detergent. There's a research to show, and there's a research to know. And I like to specialize in research to know. And I, certainly in my previous career as a market research and consumer insights specialist, I would often be asked by people, I want to do a survey that shows this. I want to do a survey that shows that this product approach that our company uses is actually the best approach for blah, blah, blah. And that's research to show. And I always tell people, be prepared not to get the answers you like. And I remember one client I worked with several years ago. They had designed this whole software as a service, or SaaS, as I don't know how you pronounce that, but they had designed this whole software service for hourly employees, basically. Things like restaurants and retail stores and things like that. And they had this whole approach. They had put together a whole company, 100 plus employees, built the whole thing. And then they wanted me to do a survey that showed, basically holes in the market where this approach would work really, really well. And I said, it may not show that, right? And I'm not going to put anything out there with my company's name on it or that I'm associated with that is a completely loaded, biased question. I'm not going to be associated with that, right? Because that's just bad. And so, we worked on a questionnaire, and sure enough, it came back that their approach was not really relevant to the marketplace. And they looked at that as a bad survey, and they, grumbled about paying, and I really never heard from them again. But what they should have done was talk to me first. They should have talked to me before they developed the product, because that's what capital M marketing is. Marketing is not just advertising and promotion. Capital M marketing is understanding the marketplace and understanding the gaps in it before you even start designing anything. I think I went way off topic here, but you'll forgive me, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously had an agenda, and the data didn't show them perhaps what they wanted to see. Does that mean then, for anyone listening, that they shouldn't at least have story or headlines that they've got in mind? They're maybe not married to them, or the data has to fall a certain way, but maybe they're thinking, out of these 3 questions, I wonder if, I suspect there is a relationship between people who do this also doing that, or vice versa.
I'll tell you what I respect the hell out of. I hope I didn't just blow the rating. Here's what I respect the heck out of. When people do a survey like that and you have to have a theory. You have to have a hypothesis. That's the scientific method, right? You absolutely have a dog in the fight. You think it's going to go one way or another, and you would bet that it's going to go one way, right? If the research comes back and it's credible and you can't really find flaws with it, and it goes against what your hypothesis was, the most awesome thing you can do is document all of that. Just talk about how I went into this thinking, boy, was I surprised when. Here's what we actually found. Here's why I thought we wouldn't see that. Now, in retrospect, here's what I think was different. I mean, the reason why a company does this kind of research is for thought leadership. It's to establish themselves as thought leaders. And boy, nothing stands out to me as someone who is a leader and someone who thinks more than someone who admits that their initial hypothesis was incorrect, and that they're not just going, yeah, but I don't believe the data. I think I'm right anyway. I'm not a big fan of that. So if your goal is thought leadership, document the whole process.
Yeah, and I guess like going back to what we're saying about like AI proof content. I mean, it doesn't get any more AI proof than that, does it? Like you're creating real world data and you're expressing genuine surprise that something isn't as you expected. So I guess if you're looking for the reach of your content and the impact of your content, it's a surefire way to set conditions in its favor, I guess.
Yeah, I think the best way to stand out in a world of, increasing usage of large language models, and I use them heavily every day, is to have a point of view, right? Is to have a clear point of view. And the one thing sometimes I like working with large language models more than humans because, I'll be working on something really complex with one of the big models, and I'll spot that it's hallucinated something. It's given me wrong numbers, and I know it because I know the data. And I'll go back and I'll say, I don't think that's right. And the best of them will go, you're right. I made a mistake. Let me go back and fix that. Boy, humans should do that.
So speaking of reporting on data, I mean, most of us, like, we're probably going to be talking relatively small sample sizes with stuff. So presumably we can't make grand statements about like entire industries if we're talking about, maybe we've got 300 to 500 people if we're lucky. How do we navigate this? Because we want to we are excited about our data, but we also know that, like, I'm not speaking for a whole industry here. I still want to present this as with my excitement. I want to make claims, but I don't want to make any claims that are over the top or false. So how do I kind of walk this tightrope?
I'm going to teach you the magic word, and that magic word is respondents. And the biggest mistake I see so many surveys make, and 99% of the surveys that are presented to the world, whether they're a quick survey of a podcast audience or somebody saying they interviewed 5,000 global marketers, is that they're self-selected. They put out a link and ask people to click on it, or they talked about it in the show and asked people to respond to it. And those are not ever going to be representative of the entire market or even representative of your audience necessarily. So you can't say marketers say this or the audience for Joe Rogan says that. You can't say that. But what you can do is say respondents. 53% of respondents said this. 47% of respondents said that. You're never going to go wrong there. All you need to do, and this is what I really love as a voracious and persnickety consumer of this kind of data, is document how you got it. And if you just say what you did, just say what you did. And if you want to go further and say, bring in some other knowledge you have about your audience, that we know that our audience tends to be extremely active online, or we know these things. Just find ways to characterize that audience. And I've done plenty of self-selected surveys like that. It's the only way that you can do things like brand lift studies on individual podcasts, unless they're the absolute biggest podcasts in the world. You have to do surveys that are called out within the show itself and ask people to come take it. And to some extent, they're like the comment cards at your local, Pizza Express or whatever. The only people that are going to fill them out are people who really had an amazing experience or people who had a terrible experience. You're not going to get the middle. I know that. People know that. So you can say, these are the most active listeners. And the other part of that, I think, just documenting it and being upfront with it enables me as a consumer of that research to be able to process it correctly. I don't discount it. There are no bad studies. There's just bad reporting of studies, right? The other thing to do, if you're surveying your audience, just to get back, a little bit more on topic here, if you're surveying the audience of your podcast and you're asking your audience to take part in something, close the loop. Talk about your findings on your show. And then you can say, we decided to change this because you didn't like it. Make people feel a part of that process. They are a part of that process. And you can say, the survey showed this. Do you agree or disagree with that? Maybe you'll get some emails. That's an engagement tactic, right? That part is not necessarily research, but it's a way to make people feel like, A, they're engaged with you and with the show, but also B, if they took the survey, that they didn't waste their time, that it was actually taken into account, and you read it and you thought, wow, that's an interesting opinion. I'm going to see if I can make that better. People love that. So close the loop.
When I'm putting together like a section in a report, a methodology, and I want to talk about the limitations of the data, what are some of the good practices? Like you've touched on this already, just say how you got the data, but some kind of top level good practices there maybe.
Yeah, you don't have to denigrate your approach in any kind of methodology or anything like that. You don't have to talk yourself down. I'm just a big fan of just being very clear, just being very, very clear about what you did. You don't necessarily have to report this, but the one thing, the variable that I would try to solve for if you're doing, an audience survey of your podcast is response rate. And, response rates, people that are in like digital marketing are used to, click-through rates that are in the tenths or hundredths of a percent. That's the language that they deal in. But, if you have a mailing list for your podcast, the first thing that you need to know to yourself is that not everybody who listens to the show is on your mailing list. So the mailing list is already people who want a deeper engagement. So that's already kind of baked into it. But just say that you surveyed your mailing list. You don't need to you don't need to cut it down any more than that. I know what you did. And the thing that you sort of privately need to solve for is response rate. And I think it's a really good goal for a podcast, which is the most engaging thing almost that you can talk to people about, to get a 5% response rate. So if you have a mailing list of 10,000 people, right? I think it would be wonderful to get 500 responses. And that's something that just, regardless of what you're reporting, you can think to yourself, that's pretty good, right? It sounds small, but it's way better than typical survey research. It's way better than, direct mail response and things like that. It's actually pretty good. Any research has a bias by the people that did not respond. But if you can get a response rate that's, 5 or north of that, then you've got a really engaged audience and you can feel better and better about the results. But again, I don't think you need to denigrate what you report. I just think you just say exactly what you did.
Hey there, quick little sidebar to talk about a tool that I've been looking a lot at recently, and is the sponsor for this episode, but because I believe it's actually a really good one for podcasters. It's called Score App. So Score App, and it's a quiz tool. So you can offer up a quiz to your listeners. They take the quiz and you can give them some personal feedback based on that quiz. The whole goal is that it's around growing your podcast's email list or directing people towards maybe products or services you have. So it's really good for growing that email list, getting more subscribers, or directing people straight to your services. The thing is, people often use, traditional lead magnets like PDFs, cheat sheets, that kind of thing. They're totally fine, but there's a lot of them around. It's kind of hard to get people excited about another free download these days. So I'm just finding these quizzes way more engaging, actually. People kind of want to take them. They're almost like going back to that old school Facebook thing where you would get a quiz like, which Harry Potter character are you, or something like that. Except Score App lets you build a quiz like that really easily, less than half an hour, which is much more focused on your listeners. So, for example, you might get a podcast for freelancers, which has a quiz like, what's your freelance business score? And you intrigue people in, and then you can give them some feedback based on the answers that they give you. Or maybe it's something like, are you ready to raise your rates? And you can give them advice on raising their rates or what average rates are. So the listeners take the quiz, they get a personalized result, and you get their email and you learn a bit about their needs. And so either you can just put them straight on your list and start emailing them and help them become more loyal listeners of your show, or you can even send them some sales material after that. So if you want to check this out, it's kind of a more fun way to better engage your listeners. It's a really smart way to build that email list, whether it's for just pure engagement and loyalty or whether it's for sales. Go over to Score App. So that's SCOREAPP, that's scoreapp.com. And there you can build your first quiz for free and see how it works. See if it might work for you.
I guess that this is a how long is a piece of string question, but how deep do we go not trying to find stories, but we want to put something out there that has maybe our own take on it, or, digging into some of the data above just providing essentially like poll answers. But again, you can get very in the weeds, and I've done this myself recently. You're looking in type form and you're looking at all sorts of correlations, and you could go down a lot of rabbit holes thinking, these people that do this, they also do this and they do this, but then you end up getting down to the sort of 5% difference in that, and you start to question the value of that. So I guess, what are some cautions that you might offer, whilst still being able to provide interesting takes and correlations in the data?
Well, the biggest thing is sample size. And I think, people always ask me, what's the sample size for a survey like this? How many, what's the sample? And for a self-selected survey like that, there's actually no great answer, because, the reason why you ask that question is when you have a survey that's done, I'll just say the other way to get in the weeds here, then you can calculate a margin of error. And that margin of error tells you the span in which that estimate is probably right. Well, you can't do that with a self-selected survey. But what you can do is avoid even reporting things that are based on really small numbers. And you get to really small numbers by doing subsets of subsets, right? And, for example, if you have a study that has 500 respondents, I think it's just fine to say men say this and women say that. I think it's probably just fine to say that 55 plus says this and 18 to 34 says that. But actually look at the number of men 18 to 34 in your study in a survey of 500. And you're in the low double digits, right? And that's where you want to be very, very careful. So, I'll give you my magic question, by the way, whenever I used to sell survey research to people because they'd want to know how much is this going to cost and how many people do I need. This is the greatest question I think I ever came up with. What is your dream headline for this study? Like if you were to read a dream headline for this study, what would that dream headline be? And a bonus question, where would you see that headline printed? And if someone's dream headline is that, Gen Z are flocking to video more than anybody else, right? Well, that tells me, all right, if I'm going to say this about Gen Z, I need several hundred Gen Z people who are creators, which means I need a survey of at least a couple thousand, maybe 3,000, in order to get a couple hundred Gen Z people, right? So that tells me how big I need this survey to be in order to at least have a couple of hundred people in a certain category. So, and just as a practice, I usually don't report anything that's under 100. And if I do, I won't list percentages because that's ridiculous. What's 67% of 40 people? That's ridiculous. And I'll just list, this is how many people, actual numbers of people said it. And people can make their own conclusions. I won't make conclusions based on that. But, ultimately, you don't want to drill down so much that the sample of people that you're looking at is just way too small. And the best way to spot that is if you start to see really wild wobbles in the numbers. If you drill down a lot and all of a sudden the percentages that you're getting are really different from each other, you've probably gone too far.
On that, reporting on percentages as well, I think I remember you saying to us a while back about, again, we're dealing with a sample size of about 560 people. Like, we could obviously report the data as like 56.7, etc. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you saying just round that up or round it down and give a kind of whole number there.
Yeah, nobody should be reporting decimal point percentages in a survey unless it's the census of your country. Because I mean, even a sample of 5,000 that's properly done has a margin of error of 1. That's a whole number. So reporting something as 0.7, conveys the sense of a precision that the survey doesn't hold up to. So just don't do it. And like I said, never report percentages when your sample's under 100. That's just, you're talking about decimal percentages of a person, and that's ridiculous.
Any other common mistakes or flaws you see in surveys that get put out there, reports that get put out there?
Yeah, I think another big one to me is, the reason why I got into this business and why I love this business is that I am a curious person. I love to discover new facts, and I also love to discover new questions. And, one of the things that it's really difficult to do in a single survey is report a correlation. Actually doing correlation analysis is like, this requires some degrees, like university degrees. It's not a straightforward process, right? So I think you make mistakes by saying this sample said this because they also do this. I think what you can say is this sample did this and this. And here's the key. If you're a curious person and you want to get better, is you iterate. The next time you do a survey, you ask about that correlation specifically. You make it specific, and then you see, okay, that hypothesis was right. It's a scientific method, right? You don't have to be a scientist to be to use that method. So just be very careful about saying people did this because of that. Just say they did this and that, and then use that in the future. I mean, almost any question I have in a survey now is based on stuff I've learned from, I don't know how many surveys I've written. It's certainly over 1,000 surveys in my life that I've written. And it's based on the results of the last one. The last one should bring up more questions. Write those questions down, never lose track of them. And then when you get ready to do this again, and you should always do this regularly, find out if that was right or not.
You yourself, you're obviously presenting data and podcasting regularly, and there's been a lot of stories around data that you yourself and Sounds Profitable have put out there. What's some of the stuff that you've worked on recently, and has any kind of surprises come from that?
Yeah, we just put out our most recent sort of large scale flagship study of the podcast audience in the United States, the podcast landscape, and that's a 5,000 person study weighted to the population. It's projectable. It's as I think as good a work in podcasting has been done, and there's a lot right now about video and video podcasting. And a lot of the questions that we asked in the podcast landscape this time were, again, based on things that arose that were unanswered or not answered satisfactorily enough in previous surveys that we wanted to continue to drill down on and continue to drill down on. And I think there's been a bit of an overreaction about video in a lot of ways. And I think that overreaction is because you need to be doing video has been conflated with you need to be on YouTube. And that's not the same thing. And so what I would say, the most surprising thing to me that came out of the most recent podcast landscape study that we did, we asked people who say that YouTube is their primary podcast app. And that's 40% of podcast consumers say that YouTube is their primary podcast app. We asked them what percentage of the podcast content that they consume is audio and what percent of it is video, right? 47% of YouTube podcast consumers, so almost half of YouTube podcast consumers, tell us more than half of their content is consumed audio only on YouTube, right? So, you do have to have some video to get on YouTube. But what that's telling me is that if we can't just be thinking video, your content has to work audio only. It has to work with your eyes closed. It has to work with your eyes away from the screen, or it's not going to work for almost half of YouTube podcast consumers. So, that's a finding I really, really want to get out there, because I think one of the things I worry about two things. I worry about podcasters dismissing YouTube, because I think you need to find a way to get not your podcast necessarily on YouTube, but I think you need to find a way to get the podcaster on YouTube to promote maybe what you're doing in other places. But I also would hate for people to be discouraged from creating because they don't want to do video. That's the last thing I would want any research I'm involved with to be associated with, is discouraging people from creating. So I think, finding out these ways in which people use YouTube maybe differently, not just as a video platform, but just as a great content search engine. That's a message I think I would love to get out there.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously and presenting this data and the kind of analysis that you're giving there, there's a lot of nuance to this, but we do sometimes see data being used incorrectly, to put it politely. Just saying that YouTube is the biggest place that people are watching, and what you're saying there is a lot of people are listening, but people might push that agenda the other way and just say, well, this shows that everyone needs to do video. If I'm selling a video recording or editing software, I might use that data kind of to push my own agenda. And I guess that's kind of just something that we're going to see more of in podcasting, unfortunately, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I just try to be really clear about our reporting. There's an old saying in my business that, people use research like a drunkard uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And I know that's going to happen, but what I always try to do is, whenever I put out a report, a presentation, or a webinar, I'm always very clear about my point of view. And I'm always very clear about what I think this means. And if I don't think something means something, I don't include it. That's the other thing about producing reports and presentations for the public, is that if you can't tell a story with a particular data slide, then don't include it. And that's not necessarily cherry picking. That's just, this did not come back as an interesting finding, right? So, there's plenty on the cutting room floor from the work that I've done. Even in Podcast Landscape, which is a gigantic study, there's going to be all kinds of stuff that we don't put out. And it's because maybe it wasn't that different from last year, or, and maybe sometimes the fact that it wasn't different from last year is a big story. But if it isn't, then, maybe leave it out this time.
What are you kind of working on at the moment?
At the moment, I am working on a couple of different studies. One is about television and film companion podcasts. I'm also working on one that is about digging in a little bit more on audio consumption on video platforms a little bit. And then, got a whole bunch of stuff coming out on non-listeners and people who have stopped consuming podcasts and why that might be.
How long have you been at Sounds Profitable now? Must be a good couple of years now.
Yeah, 3 years. I spent 18 years at Edison, and then joined Brian at Sounds Profitable in 22. So I've been there a little over 3 years.
And how have you kind of found things changing or evolving in that time?
It's really interesting. I think I loved making this change because I got to focus exclusively on podcasting. And I really wanted to do that. I wanted to move my career in that direction because I love podcasting. I love creators, and I want, uh, you know, I want creators to get paid. And it's funny, people will sometimes, uh, you know, critique various aspects of the podcast industry, as big podcasting, or, the business is taking over and the money and all that. There's no such thing as big podcasting. There's YouTube and Spotify and to some extent Amazon, all doing their own things. And then when you look at everything under them, it's not big. And, even when I go to like really independent creator conferences and people come up to me and ask me questions, their questions are generally, how do I monetize this? How do I make money? And so, I know that there's no way to make money unless you make a really quality show. And so I've always tried to focus what I've done and written about on how to be better at what you do, how to master your craft, which again, I think is very germane to this show, because you can't monetize a bad show and you can't monetize without an audience. So, I think it's harder to make it as an independent podcaster today than it was 4 or 5 years ago. The market's changed a little bit. As the market matures, it gets really hard to make it if your content is not up to snuff. And it gets really hard to make it even if your content is up to snuff, if you're getting drowned out by some of the bigger voices. So that's definitely something that's changed. But on the plus side, I think the tools we have to do better work are better. The measurement of what we do for advertisers and brands is better. The ways that you can make money without even touching advertising are better. I think the last time Patreon reported their payouts to podcasts, it's like $500 million, something like that. In a year, that's pretty good, and you don't have to run a single ad. Except for ads for yourself, for people to join your Patreon or whatever. So I think generally things are getting better. I do think it is harder for the independent podcaster to quote unquote make it, depending on what their definition of make it is. But I also ultimately think make your art. Make your art. People don't go to quilting or needlepoint conventions, everybody running around going, how do I make money with my quilting? They want to learn cool ways to quilt, and they want to make their art. And I want people to, if there's a message to get out there, even as things are changing in the industry, it's make your art. If you're getting into it to make money from the get-go, you won't. You just won't. But if you're getting into it to make some art, make your art.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a wee bit. Like, I've got a podcast that I run on the side just as a hobby, and the amount of emails I get from people that are like, "I've looked at your show, you're leaving money on the table," and I'm like, maybe I just enjoy making it. Like, I'm not that bothered. So, you kind of answered this, like, as we swing down to the end of our time. You've touched on this a fair bit already there in your last answer, but I always like to ask, there's always negativity in podcasting in some circles, but I like to ask, what's got you optimistic just now? Like I say, I know you've kind of touched on this, but if we look at maybe the next 1 to 3 or 5 years, like what are some things that have got you quite optimistic about the medium?
I think what has got me really optimistic about the medium is that when I tell people now that I'm in podcasting, they think that's really cool. They think they think, oh, wow, that's great. Oh, I love podcasts. Like when I'm talking to people who aren't podcast, industry people like we are, that has me optimistic. When I see things like the rise in smart TV consumption of podcasts, which have really ticked up in the past couple of years, that has me optimistic because that's the operating system of the living room. And that's the key to getting podcasts out of people's earbuds and shared socially and talked about socially. And ultimately, the best thing we can do to promote podcasting is to make it a shared experience. And that has me optimistic. And there's also, I think, there's still a gigantic shoe to drop in this business, and it hasn't even dropped yet. And that is making it frictionless to consume podcasts in the car. And we're not there yet. And imagine what's going to happen when we do figure that out. We have not figured that out yet. We're getting better at it, but it's not like pushing one of the 5 buttons on your in-car radio, is it? It's just not there yet. That's a hardware issue as much as a software issue. So I'm optimistic that I think there's still another rung of consumption growth that can happen when we solve that.
Yeah, you should see the state of the wee USB cable in my car. It's like an old shoelace. It's like it's still working.
Frayed. You could see the metal in between the coating on the wire and all that.
You can. Yeah, it's still doing its job, hanging on by literally a thread. I've really enjoyed our chat, Tom. Thank you so much. What would you like to point the listener towards? I know your work, it sounds profitable. You've also recently published your book as well, didn't you?
Yeah, it's I guess that actually came out last summer. The audience is listening, a little guide to building a big podcast. And it's an evergreen book. There's nothing in there about specific tools or techniques or technology that's going to go out of fashion, out of form, or out of date. So I think it's the book is the answer to the other question I get asked the most when I go to events, and that is just, how do I grow my show? How do I grow my podcast? And to me, the only answer to that ultimately is to make a better show. Everything else is tactics, and then making a better show is the only key to that. So that's called The Audience is Listening. But otherwise, everything else that I'm doing can be found at soundsprofitable.com, where we've published, I think, 21 or 22 studies in the last 3 years, and we're going to continue to put out insights and advocacy for this medium that I know we both love.
Hey, it's Colin here. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this content, please do check out the products we do as well, which supports everything we do. One of which is Alitu. A bonus to you being you get a great tool to create your podcast and make it much easier to get that show out into the world every single week. It's our podcast creator app, which includes call recording. It includes audio cleanup, from your leveling to your voice EQ to your noise reduction. It includes audio editing, including text-based editing, normal editing, and AI filters to take out your ums and ahs and all of that kind of stuff. Plus, it has podcast hosting built right in. So it really is the all-in-one. We've built it for podcasters, and we are podcasters, so we really built it to make it as easy as possible to get your show out there into the world every single week at the top possible quality. So go over to alitu.com, that's alitu.com, and we've got a 7-day free trial, so you can try it for 1 episode, see if it fits you, and hopefully you'll stick around. All right, thanks again, and we'll talk to you next time.